Everyone knows Versailles, the palace of gold, mirrors, and divine power, but behind one locked door, another Versailles existed, a smaller one, hidden, silent. Inside, young girls were brought to please a king too bored to rule. They were called companions. In truth, they were possessions. Here, Louis XV built a secret empire of desire, a private stage where the monarchy rehearsed its own downfall. And every night, France's most powerful man disappeared into a house designed for pleasure and control. If you enjoy uncovering the darkest corners of history, make sure to like and subscribe. Now, let's step inside the king's playground. Everyone had once called him the Beloved. Now, Louis XV crossed his own palace like a man walking through a mausoleum built for his younger self. The mirrors of Versailles, which once glorified him, only returned the truth. Powdered skin, heavy eyes, a body that no longer matched the portraits on the walls. Outside, France was hungry, angry, full of words. Inside, everything was still gold, but the gold felt thin. Ceremonies continued. Courtiers bowed, ladies curtsied, diplomats smiled too widely. Yet Louis felt it in the air. Their devotion had cooled into habit. They obeyed him because they had always obeyed him, not because they believed. At night, when the candles were snuffed and the last bow was given, he sat alone in rooms designed for spectacle. The vast royal bed seemed absurd for a man who now feared sleep more than work. He was not afraid of revolt. He was afraid of emptiness. Boredom for a king is a form of humiliation. It whispers that his presence changes nothing, that the kingdom would go on without him. And so, in the silence of his aging body, another hunger began to grow. It began with a whisper. A minister, discreet and loyal, mentioned a property near Versailles, small, hidden, perfect for privacy. Louis listened in silence, his fingers tracing the edge of his glass. Within weeks, the house was bought under a false name. From the outside, it looked ordinary. Pale walls, trimmed hedges, the calm of bourgeois respectability. Inside, it was remade for secrecy. Heavy curtains, perfumed sheets, mirrors placed with precision. Every detail designed to erase the world beyond its doors. Girls began to arrive quietly, one by one, poor, young, frightened. They were told they had been chosen, though none quite knew for what. Their families received money and silence. The girls received clothes, a new name, and instructions. Speak little, smile often, obey completely. The king visited at night, dressed in plain clothes. No crown, no escort. Only a carriage without crest, stopping at a back entrance. He would stay for hours, then vanish before dawn, returning to his throne with the calm of a man who had confessed his sins and found relief. Versailles suspected nothing, or pretended not to, for in France even silence could serve the crown. The house soon fell into rhythm, a ritual of pleasure disguised as routine. Each evening, servants prepared the same ceremony, candles lit, perfume burned, curtains drawn. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the king. When he arrived, the girls stood still, heads lowered. They had been taught that silence was grace, that obedience was beauty. Every gesture, every glance was rehearsed. They were not people anymore, but reflections, trained to mirror the king's desire. Louis XV no longer sought affection. He sought control. Here, he was not a fading monarch surrounded by hypocrites. Here, he was eternal, obeyed without question, adored without risk. But even in this sanctuary, something dark lingered. The laughter sounded forced, the pleasure mechanical. Each night when the door closed behind him, the silence returned heavier than before. Versailles shone brighter than ever, yet its heart was already rotting, pulsing in rhythm with that secret house nearby. The king had built his refuge, but what he really built was a mirror of his decay. It began with letters, elegant handwriting, royal seals, promises wrapped in flattery. A noblewoman or an agent of the court would visit a quiet provincial home, praising a daughter's virtue and beauty, hinting that the king himself might take interest. For families burdened by poverty, it sounded like salvation. A royal favor could erase debts, raise status, secure a future. They did not see the trap until their daughters were already gone. The girls arrived at the house trembling, clutching their rosaries, still believing they had been chosen for grace, not use. They were told to forget their names, to call themselves Mademoiselle, nothing more. They were fed, dressed, perfumed, taught to sit straight, to smile softly, to never refuse. Every kindness was calculated, every gift another chain. By the time the king entered the room, they no longer knew where fear ended and obedience began. In Versailles, the courtiers whispered that the king had found peace again. But what he had found was silence, a silence paid for in innocence. Days inside the house followed a pattern: soft voices, strict rules. The girls were forbidden to speak of their pasts. They were told those lives no longer existed. Their bodies, their gestures, even their laughter were reshaped to please the unseen rhythm of the king's desire. Elder women, chosen for discretion, trained them. How to walk without sound, how to lower the gaze at the right moment, how to answer without thought. They learned that a pause could be dangerous, that hesitation could offend. Some tried to resist, at first, but resistance was met not with punishment, but with attention. Gifts, compliments, small kindnesses that confused them more deeply than threats ever could. In time, they began to smile without being asked, to obey before being spoken to. When the king arrived, he saw only grace. He did not see the cost, the erased souls behind the perfect gestures. The house was now a mechanism, turning innocence into performance, and the man who ruled France could no longer tell the difference between devotion and training. When the girls were no longer new, the story ended quietly. No farewell, no ceremony, only a carriage waiting at dawn. Some were sent to convents with dowries paid by the crown. Others were hastily married to minor officials, soldiers, or clerks. A few simply disappeared. For Versailles, they became rumors. A shadow glimpsed in the corridors, a name whispered, then forgotten. The courtiers spoke of them as one speaks of fine wine, remembered only for the pleasure once offered. Louis never asked where they went. He liked to believe they had been taken care of. The truth was simpler. Their silence was the final service expected of them. One maid later confessed that every departure left the king quieter, more distant, as if he had lost a part of himself each time. But he kept returning to the house, needing to fill the same void again and again. Outside, the people suffered, and the word corruption began to spread like smoke through the streets. Inside the palace, no one spoke of the girls. In the kingdom of France, even innocence had become disposable. At Versailles, everyone knew and pretended not to. The king's nightly absences had become routine, another secret folded neatly into royal protocol. But among the courtiers, silence was never innocence. It was strategy. Some men offered their own nieces or daughters, hoping a single night might open a lifetime of favors. Others traded information about the house like currency. A glance, a rumor, a name. Each could buy a promotion. They called it serving His Majesty's peace. In truth, it was serving themselves. Madame de Pompadour, once the king's great mistress, kept the system alive long after their romance had cooled. She managed it like diplomacy, choosing girls, maintaining discretion, ensuring that pleasure and loyalty flowed together. Through desire, the king was ruled. Through silence, his court survived. In that web of obedience, no one was innocent. The house became more than a retreat. It was a tool, a filter, a test of power. And the courtiers smiled, because the deeper the king sank into his illusions, the freer they became. Louis believed the house belonged to him alone. His secret, his creation, his escape. But power built on pleasure is never private. Every servant, every messenger, every coachman who touched that world became part of its machinery. The secret lived in too many mouths to be contained. Still, the king clung to his illusion. Inside those walls, he could command youth, beauty, obedience. Everything the crown could no longer guarantee him in daylight. He told himself that here, at least, he was free. But freedom built on submission is only another cage. The house demanded his presence, his money, his lies. He began to live for it, arranging his schedule around the nights, avoiding his ministers, neglecting the state. Each visit left him weaker, more dependent. The monarch of France, once feared across Europe, now ruled over a kingdom of whispers and a single locked door. The court had stopped obeying out of respect. They obeyed out of habit while the real power shifted to those who guarded his secret. And for the first time, Louis XV no longer ruled Versailles. He merely haunted it. By the late 1760s, the king's authority existed mostly on paper. His ministers signed decrees he barely read, while his mind lingered elsewhere, behind that discreet door near Versailles. The court bowed, the ceremonies continued, but beneath the glitter, everyone sensed it. The throne was empty, even when he sat upon it. The Parc aux Cerfs had become a new kind of throne, one built not on marble and power, but on secrecy and flesh. There, Louis was not the beloved, he was simply obeyed. But even obedience has a cost. The more he demanded, the more he was managed. Those who controlled the flow of girls, the brokers, the mistresses, the discreet servants, began to control the king himself. What began as an escape had become dependence. Every pleasure required negotiation. Every silence had a price. At night, while the king whispered to his ghosts, pamphlets in Paris whispered louder, stories of royal depravity, of taxes funding sin, of a ruler consumed by his own appetite. And though the palace gates still glittered with gold, the people outside no longer saw majesty, only decay. The monarchy had built its own cage, and the key was already turning. It began, as all collapses do, with a whisper. A servant dismissed from the house, a letter intercepted, a rumor too delicious to ignore. By the 1770s, Parisian salons buzzed with stories of the king's secret convent. Every retelling made it darker, more obscene. Pamphlets spread like fire, hand-printed sheets filled with filth and fury. They named the house, exaggerated its rituals, accused the king of crimes against virtue, against France itself. Even the philosophers, once cautious, joined the chorus. Voltaire smirked. Diderot condemned. The myth of divine authority was cracking under the weight of gossip. Versailles panicked. Ministers burned letters, silenced servants, bribed printers, but the more they tried to hide it, the more the people wanted to see. Louis XV read a few pamphlets himself. He smiled, thinly, sadly, as if reading his own obituary. Outside, the word debauchery became synonymous with monarchy. Inside, courtiers avoided his gaze, afraid to meet the eyes of a fallen god. The playground of pleasure had turned into a public trial, and the verdict was already written, not in ink, but in shame. Across France, disgust began to masquerade as virtue. Pamphlets turned into sermons, and sermons into movements. Merchants, priests, and pamphleteers alike declared that the king's sins had infected the soul of the nation. Mothers whispered warnings to their daughters, "Don't trust the promises of nobles." Young men spoke of cleansing France, not with prayer, but with justice. The scandal of one man had become the rage of a people. For the first time, the language of desire met the language of revolution. Writers spoke of purity, of public morality, of freedom from corruption. But beneath their virtue burned envy, the hatred of those who had watched too long through palace gates. Versailles tried to pretend nothing had changed. The operas continued, the fountains played, the courtiers danced. But behind the music, there was a new rhythm, whispers of guilt, prayers for reform, talk of vengeance. And in Paris, one phrase began to echo through the cafes and alleyways: quiet, dangerous, impossible to stop. If the king can take what he wants, why shouldn't we? By 1774, the king's body failed before his crown did. Smallpox, a disease he thought belonged to peasants, crept through his skin like a quiet revenge. The courtiers who had once fought to touch his hand now kept their distance, terrified of contagion. In his final days, the mirrors of Versailles were covered. The air stank of medicine and fear. Louis XV lay surrounded by priests, murmuring prayers for a man already half forgotten. He asked for forgiveness. but not for the girls, not for the house. Some sins were too woven into his reign to untangle. When he died, the people cheered. Bells rang not for mourning, but relief. "The beloved is dead," they said, and meant it. The new king, Louis XVI, ordered the house closed, its servants dismissed, its records burned. But fire cannot erase memory. The Parc aux Cerfs had already become legend, proof that the crown had rotted from the inside. In that silence after his death, Versailles glittered again. But behind the gold, something had shifted forever. The people had seen the man behind the monarch, and they would not forget. After Louis XV's death, Versailles fell unnaturally quiet. The courtiers still dined, still bowed, still gossiped, but the laughter no longer reached the ceilings. Everywhere lingered a faint unease, as if the palace itself were ashamed of what it had hidden. The new king, young and awkward, tried to restore dignity. He reopened the churches, spoke of virtue, dismissed those who had served the old secret. But no decree could erase what France had already learned, that its kings were mortal, their pleasures human, their sins enormous. The house at the Parc aux Cerfs was stripped bare, curtains torn down, mirrors shattered, perfume faded into dust. No one spoke its name, yet everyone knew where it had stood. A scar outside the palace walls, visible only to memory. In salons and cafes, they whispered that the monarchy had died there long before the king's body did, that the revolution had not begun with hunger, but with disgust. The silence left behind by Louis XV was not peace. It was the sound of something ending, and something new beginning to breathe. Years passed, but the whispers stayed. Visitors to Versailles swore that the air still smelled faintly of perfume in one forgotten corridor, sweet, sickly, impossible to place. The servants avoided that wing after dark. They said they heard footsteps, laughter, the rustle of silk. The people of France had found a new story to tell, not of kings and glory, but of corruption and decay. In their songs and pamphlets, the Parc aux Cerfs became a symbol, the womb of revolution, the place where monarchy devoured itself. Tourists came to see the gilded mirrors, but they looked for the ghosts instead. Ghosts of girls who had learned too late what obedience cost. Ghosts of courtiers who had smiled too long. Ghosts of a king who mistook desire for power. And as France moved toward the storm of 1789, those ghosts became voices, echoing through streets, banners, and barricades. They whispered not of lust, but of justice, not of sin, but of vengeance. Versailles had once been the symbol of control. Now it had become the monument of consequence. Centuries later, Versailles still glitters. The marble floors are polished, the chandeliers glow, the tourists take pictures where kings once prayed. But beneath the gold, something trembles, a quiet reminder that power, left unchecked, always eats itself. The story of Louis XV is not only about lust or secrecy, it is about forgetting the weight of humanity beneath the crown. A man who once ruled millions, reduced to a shadow hiding behind curtains, mistaking obedience for love. Every empire ends this way, not with thunder, but with exhaustion. When desire becomes governance, when pleasure replaces purpose, the fall is only a matter of time. The revolution did not destroy Versailles. Louis XV did, stone by stone, night by night, with every secret that demanded silence. Today, visitors walk through his rooms, dazzled by beauty, unaware they are standing in a tomb, not of a man, but of belief. Because what truly died at the Parc aux Cerfs was not the king's virtue, but France's faith in the divine. And once a nation stops believing that its rulers are sacred, no throne, however gilded, can survive.